Deep within the armored bowels of the Dark Angel's flagship, the Invincible Reason, lies a realm devoid of stars. This is the Lion's Cage. It is a lightless oubliette engineered to break the minds of gods and monsters alike. Absolute, crushing blackness presses against the eyes, creating a sensory void so profound it induces immediate madness in lesser souls. The atmosphere is deliberately maintained at a punishing subglacial temperature. Rime and jagged frost bloom in endless fractal patterns across the seamless adamantium bulkheads, creeping over every rivet and seal. The air itself is thin, terribly biting, and tastes of sterile dust and forgotten millennia. Beneath the deafening silence there is a relentless, sickening vibration. It is the low, stomach-churning hum of intersecting psychic dampening null fields. These invisible currents constantly gnaw at the mind, inducing a perpetual artificial nausea that actively drains the physical will to exist. The extreme sensory starvation forces the prisoner to turn entirely inward, drowning them in the echoes of their own heartbeat and the slow death of their nerve endings. The First Legion does not build prisons for ordinary men. Their containment protocols for high-value Astartes captives are an exercise in calculated overkill, rooted in the darkest secrets of the Unification Wars. When the Dark Angels capture a brother-turned-traitor, they do not treat him as a captured general or a fallen warrior. They treat him as a chained apocalypse. Every cubic inch of this holding pen is a complex weapon turned inward upon the occupant. The localized gravity is weaponized to multiply the weight of the captive. It is a vault built for the damned, a place where living engines of war clad in ceramite are meant to be quietly forgotten in the suffocating dark. Yet the entity bound within the center of this freezing void does not despair. Suspended in the gloom is Jago Sevatarion, first captain of the Night Lords. He is shackled by specialized suppressor chains forged from dense alloys, cables thick enough to anchor a heavy battle tank. These restraints lock his limbs in a rigid, torturous crucifixion. They are not meant for mere flesh and bone, but are specifically designed to hold the tremendous kinetic fury of a transhuman Astartes. Despite the paralyzing weight, the crushing cold, and the sickening resonance of the null fields, Sevatar is perfectly calm. In the absolute pitch black, the acoustics of the chamber amplify his mere existence. There is only the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a dormant predator. Each exhalation cuts through the freezing air, slow and impossibly measured. The Prince of Crows is immobilized, but he is completely in his element. For a son of Nostramo, the shadows are never a punishment. They are a familiar, comforting embrace. He waits with the infinite patience of a born killer, his mind sharp and entirely untouched by the endless isolation. Then, the rhythmic cadence of his breathing is interrupted by a sudden shift in the ambient pressure. A heavy, mechanized grinding echoes through the adamantium walls as ancient locking mechanisms begin to violently disengage. Ponderous gears turn, fighting bitterly against the extreme cold. The hermetic seal of the oubliette breaks with a sharp release of trapped, freezing air. Through the widening crack of the heavy vault door, the first weak sliver of harsh corridor light bleeds into the cell. It illuminates the drifting motes of ice, casting long shadows across the frost before the fragile, hesitant footsteps of an unexpected visitor. The screaming grind of ancient adamantium breaks the endless silence as the heavy vault doors finally part. The pale light of the corridor spills into the tomb, revealing the frail intruder who dares to step across the threshold. She is an astropath of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a withered and brittle thing moving through the freezing mist of the cell. Her frame is violently hunched, wrapped in the heavy, somber robes of the Scholastica Psychana that seem to swallow her entirely. She leans her meager weight upon a stylized walking staff of wrought brass, its aquila head trembling with every agonizing step she takes. To look upon her is to witness a creature entirely unsuited for this merciless galaxy. Her flesh is pale as parchment, drawn tight over fragile bones. Where her eyes should be, there are only blind, sunken craters of scarred tissue. She is shivering uncontrollably. It is not merely the bone-chilling temperatures of the suppression field that cause her to tremble so violently. It is the crushing psychic weight of the room itself. The aura of the chained titan before her radiates a suffocating dread that presses against her hypersensitive mind like a physical crushing force. Her breathing is ragged, a desperate and wet gasping that sounds obscenely loud against the utter statuesque stillness of the bound space marine. He is a mountain of restrained violence, perfectly motionless, while she is a dying leaf caught in a tempest. She pushes forward only out of absolute terror of the masters she serves, driven by a duty to the First Legion that eclipses even her instinct for self-preservation. To understand the pitiable state of this woman is to understand the horrific cost of the soul binding. Every Astropath must undergo this most sacred and agonizing of rituals, their minds exposed directly to the unbearable majesty of the Master of Mankind. A fraction of the Emperor's blinding radiance and unfathomable psychic might is channeled into their minds, searing away their optic nerves and burning out their mortal vitality. The soul binding ensures that their minds are protected from the predations of the warp, but it leaves their bodies broken, ruined vessels barely clinging to physical health. They become hollow reeds through which the Emperor's will is blown, enduring constant suffering to keep the million worlds of the Imperium connected. This woman has already sacrificed her youth, her sight, and her strength to the Master of Mankind. Now, she must sacrifice her sanity by standing in the presence of a captive demigod. Every instinct screams for her to flee back into the safety of the corridor. Instead, she forces her staff against the frost-covered floor, taking one more step into the freezing abyss. Behind her, the massive gears engage once more. The heavy vault doors slam shut, sealing them inside. The sliver of corridor light vanishes, plunging the tomb back into absolute suffocating darkness. In the pitch black, the only sounds that remain are the frantic hammering of her mortal heartbeat and the slow metallic shifting of his unbreakable chains. Chapter 3. Predator and Prey. The heavy iron door seals shut, plunging the oubliette back into an absolute suffocating darkness. To observe this space is to watch a trembling prey beast dropped into the lightless den of an apex predator. In this suffocating blackness, the profound biological disparity between the two captives becomes brutally apparent. She is a creature of hollowed fragility, worn thin by the soul-draining rigors of the astropathic choir. Even in the perfect stillness of the cell, she creates a microscopic symphony of mortal terror. Her brittle bones shift against one another with the dry rasp of dead reeds in a winter wind. Her pulse is a frantic, fluttering thing, beating like a trapped bird against the thin parchment of her skin. The rough fabric of her coarse robes rustles continuously as her withered muscles tremble with involuntary spasms. She is physically blind, long stripped of her mortal sight, yet every frayed nerve ending screams that she is entirely and helplessly exposed. Across the frost-rimed adamantium deck, the apex predator waits in perfect stillness. The terrible silence of the dungeon is broken only by the heavy, grinding clink of iron constraints scraping against cracked ceramite. Beneath his ruined battleplate beats the slow, incredibly powerful thud of his secondary heart. It is a terrifyingly measured rhythm. It does not quicken, it does not falter. It is the steady, tectonic drumbeat of a killing machine waiting patiently for the moment to strike. He does not need a single lumen to see her. The Master of Mankind did not merely build soldiers when he first forged the Legiones Astartes. He engineered demigods of slaughter, weaving esoteric alchemy and sacred gene seed into mortal flesh to create living weapons capable of conquering the galaxy. Through the miraculous implantation of the oculobe, a space marine commands optical senses far beyond mortal comprehension. However, the warriors of the VIII Legion bear the dark genetic legacy of Nostramo. The gene seed of Conrad Cursor instills pitch-black eyes and a profound instinctual affinity for the deepest shadows. Sevatar possesses altered eyes that drink in the absolute darkness, turning the pitch black into a pale, perfect spectrum of predator vision. He sees the frantic pulse of her blood beating beneath the translucent parchment of her fragile skin. His towering transhuman physique radiates an overwhelming aura of dread, a psychological pressure refined by his legion into a flawless weapon. To the Night Lords, fear is not an abstract concept, but a tangible, suffocating force that breaks the minds of the weak before a single physical blow is ever struck. He watches her tremble in the dark, tasting the metallic tang of her panic on the stagnant air. She cannot see the monstrous, cold smile stretching across his scarred face, but her soul feels the crushing weight of his predatory gaze. The fragile prey knows the apex predator is preparing to feed. Yet beneath her frail physical form lies a different kind of strength. The physical realm belongs entirely to the transhuman monster wrapped in chains. There is another battlefield where her mind is completely unbound. Gathering the fragmented, bleeding shards of her courage, she focuses her will past the frantic beating of her own frail heart. She prepares to breach the silence and force her thoughts directly into the black, jagged abyss of the killer. The true battlefield between them is not formed of plascrete and chains. It is the silent, treacherous expanse of the immaterial realm. The Astropath gathers her will, closing her physical eyes to open the singular burning eye of her soul. She extends her mind outward, casting a delicate psychic tendril into the darkness of the cell to probe the consciousness of the captive. She prepares her mental defenses for an onslaught of madness. To touch the mind of a heretic Astartes is to invite the screaming abyss into one's own skull. She expects a tempest of warp, corrupted agony, a chaotic maelstrom of bloodlust and demonic whispers that define the fallen champions of the archenemy. Instead, her psychic probe strikes a monolithic wall of cold, sharpened iron. There is no raging demon lurking within the skull of Jago Sevatarion. There is only a hyper-focused, razor-sharp intellect balancing precariously upon the edge of its own psychic torment. The sheer weight of his presence in the warp is staggering, radiating an icy hostility that freezes the breath in her lungs. It is an anomaly that defies the teachings of the Scholastica Psychana. Sevatar possesses a repressed, latent psychic talent, a curse that has haunted him since his youth on the sunless streets of Nostramo, where the sorcerers of the traitor legions surrender to the warp, twisting their minds to channel eldritch horrors. The first captain binds his soul in chains of absolute mental discipline. While his abilities most famously manifest as precognitive flashes, granting him a preternatural edge in the chaos of melee combat, his telepathic will remains a suffocating, latent force. He views his psychic potential not as a gift from the dark gods, but as a vile affliction to be suffocated under layers of unbreakable willpower. This relentless suppression has forged his mind into an impenetrable fortress. The Astropath finds herself a trespasser before iron gates, her intrusion instantly noticed by the apex predator within. Sevatar speaks his first words. His voice is a venomous, rasping whisper that bypasses the air entirely, a psychic resonance that physically vibrates the frail ribs of the blind woman. A dry, cutting amusement bleeds through the telepathic link, mocking her feeble attempt to breach his thoughts. The unspoken warning is absolute. She is knocking on a door she does not truly wish to open. The raw, unaugmented pressure of his mind pushes back against hers with the force of a falling leviathan. The Astropath violently severs the connection, reeling backward as if struck by a physical blow. She gasps for the recycled air of the cell, her heart hammering wildly against her sternum. The telepathic approach is a resounding failure, crushed by the overwhelming sanity of a monster. She realizes that if she is to glean any truth from the Prince of Crows, she must do so in the crude physical realm. She forces her trembling jaw to steady, parting her lips to speak the question that brought her into the dark. The psychic assault had yielded nothing but shattered glass in the mind of the interrogator. Now came the fragile human voice. The Astropath broke the heavy silence of the cell with a single word. She asked him why. It was not a demand of inquisitorial fury, but a fading, terrified whisper. It trembled with genuine, desperate confusion. She looked upon the ruin of the first captain of the Night Lords and sought a simple, comforting narrative to justify her rigid worldview. She expected him to scream of warp-spawned madness, to rant of treacherous delusions whispering in the void, or perhaps to spit venom about perceived slights from a distant emperor. She needed a monster driven by madness or petty malice, something her indoctrinated mind could easily categorize and dismiss. Instead of a madman's roar, the darkness answered with a low, dark chuckle. It was a sound devoid of theatrical villainy. It was merely the calm, cynical amusement of a legionary forced to explain the fundamental principles of tactical calculus to a particularly slow child. Jago Sevatarion did not yell. He did not strain against his bindings. He simply breathed in the stale air of his captivity and prepared to dismantle the fragile illusions of his captor. To understand the profound weight of his calm, one must look to the ashes of the Thramas Crusade. Sevatar was not some hapless victim dragged kicking and screaming into an imperial dungeon. For 3 grueling years, he had orchestrated a masterclass of protracted guerrilla warfare across the eastern fringe. The Night Lords had bled the stoic Dark Angels in 1,000 brutal engagements across dead worlds and burning star systems. Sevatar had fought the First Legion to a bloody standstill, dancing through the void with lethal precision. He had outmaneuvered Lord Commanders and proved a tactical genius that rivaled the greatest minds of the Legion's Astartes. His capture by the Sons of the Lion was the result of a desperate, bloody boarding gambit, the violent culmination of a savage campaign where he had repeatedly shattered the rigid martial doctrines of the Imperium. He sat now in the dark, a chained leviathan, looking down upon a mortal who dared to ask him of morality. The Astropath wanted to know why he had turned his back on the sacred light of the Master of Mankind. Sevatar found the very premise of her question completely absurd. To him, there was no blinding light of righteousness to abandon, only the cold, harsh truth of a galaxy built on endless hypocrisy. He tested the unyielding tension of his heavy iron restraints, his voice dropping into a lethal register as he began his dark intellectual counteroffensive. He did not offer her the comfort of a chaotic delusion or a villainous monologue. He offered her a shattered mirror. He asked her to define the light she so blindly worshipped, systematically stripping away the golden veneer of the Great Crusade. He would not answer her plea for a neat moral justification. Instead, the Prince of Crows prepared to show her the true and bloody foundation of the empire she served. Chapter 6. Mocking the Imperial Truth. Betrayal is a word reserved for those who still believe in the lie. Sevatar did not roar in defense of his treasons. He merely offered a low, rasping chuckle that echoed against the frost, rhymed adamantium of his confinement. He asked the shivering Astropath what exactly she thought he had betrayed. He wondered aloud if it was the grand, glittering illusion of the Imperial Truth. He gestured with heavy, chain-wrapped hands to the lightless corners of his oubliette. He invited her to look closely at the rusted torture implements lining the walls, the blood-stained drains, and the cold iron cages suspended in the gloom. This was the true reality of the Emperor's enlightened age. Sevatar turned his obsidian gaze upon the Astropath herself. He mocked her very existence with surgical precision. He asked her how a blind, enslaved mutant, her mind chained to the blinding radiance of the soul-binding, could possibly preach to him of a civilized empire. She was a living battery, an aberrant soul tolerated only because she was useful to the great war machine. He forced her to admit the physical reality of the dungeon they shared. He stripped away the veneer of golden eagles and marble statues to reveal the slaughterhouse floor beneath them. The Astropath could offer only a defensive stammer against his relentless logic. Sevatar had effortlessly turned her interrogation into a merciless prosecution of the Imperium itself. The Imperial Truth was always the greatest and most grotesque hypocrisy of the Great Crusade. The Master of Mankind claimed to be conquering the galaxy in the name of secular rationality, human elevation, and the eradication of superstition. Yet this beacon of ultimate enlightenment was built entirely upon the charred bones of billions. Worlds that merely wished to be left in peace were subjected to apocalyptic xenocides and planetary compliance actions that were nothing more than glorified massacres. The Emperor demanded a galaxy governed by science and reason, but he fueled his interstellar empire with the systematic enslavement of the very mutants and psychers he claimed to despise. Armadas of black ships roamed the stars, harvesting human souls by the thousands to feed a ravenous psychic choir. The secular paradise was enforced by genetically engineered butcher gods and legions of transhuman monsters bred only to kill. Reason and enlightenment were delivered at the edge of a screaming chainsword. Sevatar knew this better than anyone. He leaned forward in his chains, letting the sheer absurdity of her righteous indignation hang in the freezing air. The Imperium was not a beacon of hope falling into darkness, but a sprawling empire of carrion that had finally stopped pretending to be alive. To call his actions a betrayal was to imply that the oath he swore was ever honest to begin with. His bitter amusement faded into a cold, clinical focus. If the Astropath wanted to understand why he stood in midnight clad as a traitor, she first had to understand what it meant to be born into the dark. She had to look past the lies of the present and peer into the bloody, shadow-drenched origins of his brotherhood. Chapter 7. We were always murderers. Speaking over the terrified gasps of the frail Astropath, Jago Sevatarion dismantled the greatest lie of the Horus heresy. He laughed at the very concept of corruption. One cannot fall from a summit they never climbed. The other legions wept for their lost nobility, mourning the tarnished ideals of a broken crusade. Sevatar offered no such pathetic lamentations. He stated a cold and undeniable truth. The VIII Legion never changed. They did not lose their way in the dark, because the dark was their birthplace. It is logically impossible to betray an ideal you never held in your heart. The Night Lords were never meant to be noble knights in shining armor. They were designed to be exactly what they became. They were the Emperor's sanctioned butchers, engineered to wield terror as an instrument of state. Long before the Primarch Conrad Kurz was ever found on the midnight streets of Nostramo, the VIII Legion was already forged in blood and sin. Their origins did not lie in the noble academies or the martial clans of ancient terror. The master of mankind reached into the deepest, most lightless subterranean prisons of the throne world. He harvested his genetic stock from the dregs of humanity. He took the murderers, the psychopaths, and the unrepentant sinners who languished in the dark. These were men whose bloodlines were already soaked in the thrill of an unjustified kill. The Emperor did not purge these vile instincts from their augmented minds. He weaponized them. He wove the genius of the gene seed into the very DNA of Terra's most prolific butchers. The VIII Legion was built to be a vanguard of sheer, unadulterated terror. They were meant to do the bloody work that the golden heroes of the Imperium found too distasteful to stomach. The Astropath wept tears of blood as these brutal facts shattered her indoctrinated faith. Sevatar stripped away every shred of romanticized mythology surrounding the Adeptus Astartes. The Imperium loves to paint its angels of death as tragic figures who were seduced by the ruinous powers. The first captain of the Night Lords rejected that comforting fiction entirely. There was no seduction. There was no tragic descent into madness. They simply acted according to their fundamental nature. They skinned the innocent and butchered the guilty with equal indifference because that was the purpose woven into their flesh by the Emperor himself. They were a legion of butchers commanding a fleet of slaughterhouses. To claim they were corrupted implies that they were once pure. They were never pure. Every atrocity they committed was merely a continuation of their original design. Sevatar forced the broken psyker to understand the ultimate hypocrisy of the Imperial Truth. The galaxy was brought to heel not by enlightened philosophers, but by engineered psychopaths. The Night Lords wore the flayed skin of their victims long before they ever rebelled against the Emperor of mankind. They were terrifying, sadistic, and utterly devoid of mercy. Yet Sevatar made it perfectly clear that this was not a failure of their morality. It was the triumphant success of their engineering. If they are to be judged as monsters, then let the galaxy understand the true source of their monstrous nature. They are monsters only because the Emperor demanded monsters. Chapter 8. The Mask Slips. The truth of the VIII Legion is a bloody mirror held up to the master of mankind. For if the Night Lords are monsters born to a specific and violent purpose, then the architect of their creation cannot claim the pristine mantle of righteousness. Sevatar fixes his unblinking gaze upon the trembling Astropath, his voice stripped of all sardonic amusement and vibrating with a lethal, absolute conviction. He delivers a philosophical strike far more devastating than any physical blow. The Emperor of mankind, Sevatar declares, is the greatest liar in the history of the galaxy. The Horus heresy is not some tragic, unforeseen rebellion against a benevolent father. It is merely the violent, inevitable collapse of a monumental web of deceit. The Emperor forged his sons to conquer the stars, demanding they drown thousands of worlds in blood to build his glorious imperium. He unleashed weapons of mass terror into the dark to do a butcher's work. Yet when the galaxy was finally bleeding and compliant, this grand architect suddenly found the crimson hands of his executioners too unseemly for his new, civilized epoch. Sevatar's disdain is a corrosive acid that burns through the Astropath's most cherished articles of faith. He speaks of a creator who shifted the moral goalposts whenever it suited his vast political needs, demanding total savagery in the shadows while preaching absolute enlightenment in the blinding light. The hidden annals of history bear out the first captain's bitter thesis in full. Consider the weeping ashes of Monarchia, where the word-bearers were humiliated and their perfect devout city was reduced to radioactive glass. Lorgar Aurelian was punished for the crime of reverence, brutally chastised for worshipping a supreme being who deliberately engineered his genetic structure with an overwhelming need for spiritual truth. The Emperor built a prophet and then burned his prophecy to the ground. Consider the Council of Nicaea, the great and terrible betrayal of the Thousand Sons. Magnus the Red was brought to heel and publicly condemned for wielding the very psychic potential his father had deliberately woven into his primordial DNA. The master of mankind designed a peerless sorcerer, only to outlaw sorcery when the terrifying reality of the warp became inconvenient to his grand design. These were not the sudden moral failures of wayward sons. These were the ultimate hypocrisies of a fickle creator punishing his living tools for performing the exact functions they were organically forged to execute. The Astropath listens, trapped in a paralyzing snare of terrifying logic. The foundational dogmas of terror crack and splinter beneath the crushing weight of Sevatar's relentless truth. If the Emperor is a hollow hypocrite who fiercely denies his own bloody nature, then the high-minded rhetoric of the Loyalists is nothing but ash and dead wind. Sevatar watches the horrifying realization dawn upon the blind woman's ruined face. With the gilded mask of imperial righteousness thoroughly shattered and the Emperor revealed as a tyrant dressed in lies, the first captain does not bother to seek absolution for the darkness in his own soul. Instead, he turns the razor edge of his argument toward his own brothers, moving to vindicate the gruesome nature of the VIII Legion. If the entire galaxy was built on a hidden foundation of merciless slaughter, then the Masters of Fear merely practiced the most honest form of warfare. Chapter 9. Introduction to Terra Tactica. The illusion of righteous conquest is stripped away, leaving only the cold mechanics of subjugation. Sevatar does not merely critique the hypocrisy of the throne, he replaces it with the chilling pragmatism of the VIII Legion. He locks his absolute focus upon the trembling Astropath, his voice dropping into the measured cadence of a scholar elucidating a masterwork. This is the Terra Tactica. It is the philosophy of dread, refined into an exact science. To the idealistic iterators and scribes of the Council of Terror, the Night Lords are mere butchers, driven by mindless sadism and base cruelty. Sevatar despises such profound ignorance. He speaks of fear not as a savage impulse, but as an instrument of immaculate precision. It is a scalpel wielded against the psyche, a weapon far sharper than any power sword and infinitely more devastating than the most punishing orbital bombardment. He possesses a craftsman's pride in the architecture of systemic dread, viewing the subjugation of a world as a magnum opus written in screams. Consider the standard machinery of imperial compliance. When a rebellious world defies the Pax Imperialis, the grand strategos of the Great Crusade deploy vast armadas and endless regiments of the imperial army. They rely upon the grinding gears of mass troop deployment and the unrelenting, unimaginative calculus of attrition. Mighty hive cities are leveled to ash by macro-cannon barrages, their infrastructure pulverized into radioactive dust. Generations of men and women are fed into the insatiable meat grinder of orthodox trench warfare. Their blood buys every bloody mile of conquered earth. Millions perish in a chaotic symphony of mutual annihilation, leaving behind a broken, starving world ruled over by grieving spectres. Sevatar views this traditional warfare as a grotesque failure of imagination, a catastrophic waste of human capital masked as martial honor. The Night Lords offer a radically different, entirely utilitarian paradigm. They do not engage in the clumsy butchery of the open battlefield. Their application of psychological warfare is surgical, deliberate, and deeply calculated. It is a profound waste of martial resources to butcher 10 million defiant soldiers when the agonizing, localized flaying of 100 planetary aristocrats will achieve the exact same compliance. It is the ultimate economy of violence. A single, perfectly orchestrated atrocity broadcast across the planetary Vox networks can shatter the collective will of an entire hemisphere in a single solar day. Dread spreads faster than any biological contagion. It paralyzes planetary defense forces within their own fortified bunkers, and it turns the terrified populace against their own commanders in desperate, weeping bids for mercy. Sevatar watches the Astropath process this dreadful, inescapable logic. He sees the horrified fascination taking root behind the Psyker's scarred and empty sockets. The first captain is deeply engaged now, slipping effortlessly into the role of a grim philosopher lecturing a captive student in the dark. He wants the frail woman to truly understand the elegant mathematics of terror, to see past the flayed skin and behold the brutal mercy hidden beneath the viscera. Subjugation by fear saves billions of lives that would otherwise be lost to the grinding treads of the imperial war machine. To illuminate this dark truth, Sevatar raises a massive chain-wrapped hand, his scarred fingers tracing an invisible shape in the stagnant air of the prison cell. He leans forward, his voice a lethal whisper, and invites the blind mystic to entertain a strictly practical proposition. Chapter 10. The Flayed Hundred. The blind woman trembles, physically nauseated by the sheer weight of the concept hanging in the chilling air between them. Sevatar remains perfectly still, a statue of midnight ceramite, waiting with the infinite patience of a predator for her mind to grasp the geometry of his doctrine. He offers her a vision, a thought experiment painted in the visceral hues of the VIII Legion. Imagine a world of billions, defiant and fortified, refusing the light of the Imperial Truth. A standard compliance action by another legion would mandate planetary invasion, orbital bombardment, and the grinding slaughter of millions in the mud of protracted siege warfare. The Night Lords offer a different calculus. They slip through the void like ghosts, bypassing the bristling orbital defense grids and ignoring the mustered millions of the planetary defense forces. They strike precisely at the apex of the hierarchy. The planetary governor and exactly 99 of his ruling council are abducted in the dead of night. Then the true compliance begins. The Lords of the Eighth do not execute them in secret. They suspend these architects of rebellion within the broadcast chambers of the capital, rigging the planetary Vox, network and Pict casters to maximum output. They flay the 100 alive, strip by quivering strip, over the span of agonizing hours. Every screen, every public address servitor, every household Vox receiver is hijacked to project the unadulterated symphony of their torment. The populace of the entire world is forced to listen to the gurgling, wet shrieks of their infallible leaders being peeled down to the muscle. No static is permitted to interrupt the broadcast. No mercy is given to the dying, who are kept conscious through the foulest alchemies of the apothecarian. When dawn finally breaks over the shivering cities, the screaming stops, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. By the time the first rays of the local star touch the spire of the governing palace, the entire world surrenders unconditionally. The true horror, Sevatar explains with chilling calm, is the pure efficiency of the atrocity. Not a single shot is fired by the entrenched armies. Not a single hive block is leveled by macro cannon fire. The infrastructure remains entirely pristine, ready to tithe to the Imperium the very next cycle. This was the grim reality of campaigns like Charlotte, where targeted, abhorrent violence inflicted upon a microscopic fraction of the populace broke the spine of planetary resistance overnight. The chronicles of the Great Crusade are stained with worlds brought into the fold without the mass exterminations favoured by the more celebrated legions. The Astropath clutches her robes, gagging on the psychic residue of his words, unable to reconcile the monstrous cruelty with the bloodless result. Sevatar tilts his gauntleted head, observing her fragile morality shatter under the weight of his logic. He prepares to lay bare the ultimate hypocrisy of his brothers, asking her to weigh the flayed flesh of 100 aristocrats against the pulverized bones of 1 billion conscripts. "Consider the alternative," Sevatar whispered, the venom in his voice dripping like acid upon the fragile mind of the Astropath. Picture the very same world, but visited instead by the Praetorian and his vaunted 7th Legion. Rogal Dorn arrives in a storm of defiant auramite and gleaming gold, flying the banners of righteousness. He does not strike from the shadows, nor does he single out the guilty for punishment. Instead, he offers a formal declaration of compliance, giving the defiant rulers time to muster their armies and entrench their populations. This is the honourable way, the noble path of open war. The sky ignites not with the screams of a few, but with the blinding fury of orbital macro-cannon bombardments. To prepare the theatre of battle, the Imperial fists systematically dismantle the planet from the void. They encircle the defiant hive cities, and in doing so, they slowly choke the life from the millions trapped within. Blockades are mercilessly enforced. Vital hab sectors are ground to dust beneath a relentless mathematical siege. Then the true slaughter begins, a grinding, attritional nightmare of trench warfare that consumes the entire world. For 6 grueling months, the relentless war machine churns the earth into a slurry of mud and blood. 10 million soldiers are fed into the meat grinder of conventional combat, their bodies shredded by mass reactive bolt rounds and relentless artillery fire. Behind the lines, cut off from supply and shelter, 2 million innocent civilians quietly starve to death in the frozen ruins of their once proud cities. But the scribes of terror will record it as a glorious victory, fought face to face, shield to shield. There is a profound institutional madness in this rigid adherence to orthodox warfare. The dogmatic doctrines that codify the standard Adeptus Astartes mentality demand structured lines of battle, symmetric engagements, and the overwhelming application of massed force. When Space Marines deploy in traditional frontal assaults, they do not merely defeat an enemy. They erase the very landscape, treating thriving cities as tactical obstacles to be leveled and vast populations as acceptable collateral damage in the strict mathematics of attrition. The dogma of honourable combat dictates that millions must perish in the dirt to preserve the moral superiority of the conqueror. Dorn leaves behind a broken, starved and traumatized world, a wasteland of corpses and craters that will take centuries to rebuild. Yet the Imperium calls this a pristine compliance, praising the staggering death toll as a monument to martial valor. Sevatar laughed, a dry, rattling sound that held no joy, only absolute contempt for the hypocrisy of his supposedly noble brothers. He forced the trembling Astropath to look upon the raw, bloody math of this historical comparison. On one hand, a single week of terror, a few hundred flayed corpses, and a perfectly intact world brought to its knees without a single fired macro shell. On the other, half a year of honourable devastation, 12 million corpses, and a burning husk of a shattered civilization. The first captain leaned into the darkness, his midnight armour swallowing the dim light of the holding cell. He prepared to ask the broken psychic conduit a question that would completely shatter the very foundation of imperial righteousness. Chapter 12, The Bloody Calculus. The psychological trap finally snaps shut. Sevatar leans forward into the meagre light of the cell. Heavy iron chains groan and clatter against the stone, echoing like a death knell in the oppressive dark. He fixes his black, soulless eyes upon the trembling Astropath, letting the silence stretch until it becomes absolute agony. Then he poses the ultimate paradox of the Great Crusade. "I killed 100 rulers in agony," he whispers, the words dripping with cold amusement. "Dorn killed 12 million innocents in honor. Tell me, little psychic parasite, which of us is truly more humane? Which method left more humanity intact to serve your emperor?" The Astropath tries to speak. She opens her mouth to offer a platitude of faith, to scream a desperate denial of his twisted logic, but she chokes on the ash of her own hypocrisy. No words come forth. Her mind fractures under the sheer, crushing weight of profound cognitive dissonance. She cannot refute the math. This is the buried truth at the very core of the Imperium of man. The Great Crusade was never a campaign of righteous illumination. It was a relentless engine of absolute compliance, fueled by a dark and uncompromising utilitarianism. Other Primarchs dressed their planetary slaughter in the noble raiments of martial pride. They waged glorious wars of attrition that leveled entire continents and ground billions of innocent civilians into dust beneath the treads of their war machines. They called it honor. They called it valor. The Night Lords merely stripped away this hypocritical veneer. They looked upon the bloody math of galactic conquest and found a faster, darker path. Why burn a world when you can flay its governor? Why slaughter a generation of youth in the mud of a shattered trench when a single broadcast of planetary torture will bring a solar system to its knees? The sons of Kurz did not invent the inherent cruelty of the Imperium. They simply optimized it. They weaponized terror to preserve the material wealth and biological stock their emperor so greedily demanded. The silence in the cell returns, thick and suffocating, broken only by the shuddering breaths of the defeated telepath. Sevatar watches her spirit shatter, his scarred face an emotionless mask of pale marble. He is triumphant, an intellectual predator who has perfectly cornered his prey. Yet there is no joy in his victory, only the cold satisfaction of a bitter truth laid bare before the blind. He knows this brutal calculus intimately. It is not a philosophy learned from the pristine tacticas of terror or the golden war councils of the emperor. To understand the origin of this flawless predatory logic, one must look back into the suffocating dark. Sevatar turns his thoughts away from his weeping captor, his mind drifting across the stars to the place where such ruthless mathematics were first etched into his soul. He remembers the sunless world of his youth. He remembers Nostramo. The first captain allowed the Astropath to choke on the cold mathematics of terror. He watched the frail psyker tremble, his scarred lips twisting into a shadow of bitter nostalgia. Slowly, Sevatar shifted the narrative away from the burning stars, casting his captive audience down into the poisoned gravity of his homeworld. To comprehend the philosophy of the VIII Legion, Sevatar whispered, one had to breathe the ash of Nostramo. Nostramo was a sphere of eternal, suffocating midnight. Its sun was a dying, pale anomaly, forever entombed behind a thick atmospheric crust of toxic smog. This choking mantle belched endlessly from thousands of continent-sized refineries. No natural light ever graced the bruised and pallid skin of the populace. It was a sociological nightmare forged in the crushing pressure of the adamantium mining hives. Deep beneath the earth, millions of diseased, starving laborers broke their bodies to extract the priceless ore. The wealth of the world flowed upward, but the misery only deepened. Above the subterranean hell, the spire cities were ruled not by noble governors or learned magistrates. They were controlled by an absolute syndicate of murderers. The planetary elite were nothing more than cartel butchers draped in stolen velvet and gold. They governed their wretched domains through unchecked, arbitrary slaughter. There was no law on Nostramo, only the sudden, fatal flash of a blade in the dark. Violence was the sole recognized currency. If a man possessed a scrap of bread or a sliver of clean water, he kept it only as long as he could butcher whoever came to take it. In this absolute vacuum of consequence, human morality suffered a total and terminal collapse. Concepts of charity, honor, and decency withered and died in the chemical rain. Goodness did not exist on Nostramo. To be good was simply to volunteer for victimhood. To show mercy was to eagerly invite your own agonizing execution. Sevatar painted a world where children learned to gouge eyes before they learned to speak. Every shadowed corner held a desperate predator. Every industrial alleyway was a mass grave waiting to be filled with the weak. The ruling cartels exacted their brutal tithes in flesh and terror. They strung up dissenters from the rusted gantries of the macro smelters, leaving them to rot in the sulphurous wind as a warning to the masses. A society cannot survive indefinitely when its foundational pillar is unadulterated, cannibalistic predation. Nostramo was bleeding to death, devouring its own rotting soul in a ceaseless frenzy of greed and paranoia. The steady export of adamantium was the only thing preventing the wider galaxy from noticing the planetary decay. It was a world rotting in isolation, begging for the swift mercy of total annihilation. No conventional force could have salvaged such a deeply broken civilization. The disease of cruelty had infected the very bedrock of the planet. Yet the unforgiving currents of fate had a different design for the dying sphere. The absolute absence of justice created a void that demanded to be filled. Something plummeted from the heavens, destined to shatter the endless reign of the crime syndicates. A strange and terrible savior was cast into the deepest, most toxic slums of Nostramo Quintus. Chapter 14. The Coming of the Night Haunter. Into this abyss of irredeemable depravity fell a god of vengeance. He did not come bearing the light of civilization, nor did he offer the hollow platitudes of diplomacy, politics, or education. Conrad Kurzer, the Night Haunter, understood that a world soaked in sin could only be cleansed by a tide of blood. Sevatar speaks of his genesire's early work not with the shame of a butcher, but with the cold reverence of a master craftsman admiring a flawless design. He watched as his father transformed the very concept of fear into an inescapable weapon. The pacification of Nostramo was an exercise in extreme, theatrical, unrelenting violence. Kurz did not arrest the cartel lords or debate the corrupt nobility in grand senate halls. He hunted them down and skinned them alive in the public squares. He hung the bloated aristocrats from the flickering glow of the city lumen stanchions, their broken bodies suspended by their own glistening intestines. He made the ubiquitous smog and the suffocating shadows of the underhive a lethal, breathing threat. To walk in the dark was to invite the judgment of a phantom who knew every sin and punished them all with agonizing prejudice. The flayed corpses were left as monuments to his justice, stinking in the toxic air to remind the living of the cost of transgression. And the terrifying truth, the truth that makes the weak-willed Astropath weep and tremble, is that the slaughter yielded perfection. Crime stopped overnight. The rampant murder, the extortion, the endless cycle of abuse simply ceased to exist. The nightmare streets of Nostramo became safe for the first time since the onset of Old Night. The defenseless could walk through the darkest alleys untouched. The destitute toiled without the lash of the gangmasters. A peace was achieved, a flawless and absolute tranquility bought entirely with the blood of the wicked and the paralyzing terror of the masses. This was the grand vigilante crusade of Konrad Kurze. It was a brutal, necessary theorem proven upon the flesh of a broken world. Kurze demonstrated that on a planet utterly bereft of morality, virtue is a fatal weakness. The only way to enforce compliance upon a society of monsters is to become a horror far greater than the criminals you hunt. He became the apex predator in a jungle of murderers, ensuring that the fear of the law was infinitely more profound than the greed of the lawless. He did not merely punish crime, he eradicated the very thought of it through the promise of infinite agony. The Astropathic choir recoils at the concept of peace through such grotesque butchery, utterly unable to reconcile the monstrous slaughter with the serene silence it purchased. But the first captain of the VIII Legion harbours no such fragile illusions. Sevatar looks upon the pacified graves of Nostramo and sees a perfect mechanism of societal control. He sees a dark enlightenment born in the flaying pits and the rusted gantries. As he reflects on the screams that silenced a wretched world, Sevatar begins to distill the gruesome lesson of his home into a cold, universal doctrine. From the blood-soaked streets of Nostramo, Jago Sevatarion extracted a profound, devastating thesis. He did not view the butchery of his Primarch as an act of mere vengeance, but as a masterpiece of sociological revelation. Immobilized, yet commanding the space with his presence, the first captain spoke with the detached precision of a high academic lecturing on the fundamental laws of the universe. He spoke of the million worlds scattered across the galactic dark, human civilizations isolated for thousands of years. Across these fractured empires, human cultures had mutated into wildly unrecognizable societies. To Sevatar, the very tools of imperial compliance were flawed from their inception. Concepts of honor, justice, duty, and love are nothing but subjective, fragile constructs. They are cultural delusions that shift and break depending on the atmosphere of the world they inhabit. Diplomacy built upon such shifting sands is doomed to fail. But biology, Sevatar reasoned, remains absolute. Beneath the varied garbs of savage tech barbarians and enlightened philosopher kings beats the same primitive heart. Every human nervous system is wired to understand the sudden, blinding agony of severed flesh. Every human mind, no matter how elevated, harbors an ancestral terror of the suffocating dark. Fear is the only true universal language. It is the single psychological lever that bridges all human cultures with absolute, inescapable certainty. This was not merely a philosophical observation, but a bleak evolutionary truth forged in the crucible of Old Night. For 5,000 years, the Age of Strife drowned the galaxy in madness, demonic incursions, and Xenos predation. During that terrible epoch, humanity was reduced to prey. Those 5 millennia of unending horror traumatized the human species on a cellular level. Evolution stripped away the gentler traits of mankind, selectively breeding survivors who were genetically predisposed to flinch at shadows and respond instinctively to terror. The Age of Strife left behind a species fundamentally hardwired for paranoia. Sevatar understood that the Emperor was attempting to build a utopia using a species genetically engineered by trauma to expect only the slaughterhouse. As the words flowed from the master of the Atramentar, the bound Astropath listened in mounting dread. The terror did not come from a threat of physical violence, but from the horrifying realization taking root in the Psyker's mind. Sevatar was not a raving sociopath. He was not a deranged butcher intoxicated by the scent of gore. He was completely, flawlessly, terrifyingly sane. His logic was an inescapable labyrinth of clinical deduction. If fear was the only biological absolute of the human condition, then everything else was an artificial lie. Sevatar did not stop at simply justifying the terror tactics of the Night Lords. He took this inescapable biological truth and turned it against the very foundations of civilization. With a cold and unwavering gaze, the first captain prepared to take his scalpel to the grandest illusions of them all. Chapter 16. The Illusion of Morality. You cling to the pathetic notions of right and wrong as if they were physical shields. Sevatar looks down at the broken creature trembling before him, watching the last embers of defiance die in the Psyker's milky eyes. He explains with a patience that borders on the monstrous that morality is the greatest lie ever told to the human species. Right and wrong are nothing more than comforting bedtime stories. They are the fables the Imperium tells itself so its citizens can sleep at night while its armies commit galactic genocide by the hour. The Emperor bathes the stars in the blood of countless worlds, yet humanity wraps this slaughter in the gilded robes of righteousness. The VIII Legion possesses no such hypocrisy. Sevatar lets his suffocating presence expand, the psychological chill of his midnight armor bleeding into the freezing air of the interrogation cell. He tells the Astropath that in a universe overflowing with nightmares, moral alignments simply do not exist. There is no good. There is no evil. There are only two factual states of existence in this hostile galaxy. There is order and there is anarchy. To believe otherwise is to invite extinction. The Night Lords understand the philosophical nihilism of the cosmos better than any of their brother legions. They are not chaotic beasts driven by mindless malice. They are the ultimate brutal authoritarians. In a galaxy populated by apex predators and cosmic horrors, pity is a fatal weakness. Compassion is a disease that rots an empire from within. The Sons of Curse do not care about being perceived as right or just. They care only about enforcing absolute compliance. They achieve this through the steady, calculated application of the only tool that has ever truly worked: atrocity. By committing unspeakable horrors against a few, they guarantee the submission of the many. It is a terrifyingly pure mathematics of survival. Sevatar dismantles the Astropath's entire worldview, stripping away the golden veneer of the Imperial Truth to reveal the rotting, bloody gears of the machine beneath. He asks the trembling Psyker how many billions must die in honourable, drawn-out campaigns before the Imperium realises that a single flayed planetary governor saves countless lives. The logic is flawless, devoid of passion and utterly crushing. It drops upon the captive like an executioner's blade. The Night Lords are the monsters required to keep worse monsters at bay. They are the darkness that ensures the light survives, even if they must extinguish their own humanity to do it. In the cramped, suffocating shadows of the cell, the weight of this inescapable revelation finally breaks the last fragments of the Astropath's sanity. The universal language of terror has bypassed her psychic wards and infected her very marrow. The grand, sweeping philosophies of the Great Crusade dissolve against the cold, frost-rimed adamantium of her prison. There is no righteous saviour waiting in the void, only the looming shadow of the first captain and the agonizing truth of an indifferent universe. Her breath hitches in her bleeding throat as the sheer physical reality of her doom finally takes hold. In the suffocating dark of the holding cell, the Prince of Crows let his absolute binary truth hang in the freezing air. The Astropath sat curled upon the unforgiving iron floor, her fragile frame vibrating with violent tremors. She was not shaking because of the absolute zero temperature bleeding through the hull of the invincible reason. She was trembling because the bedrock of her entire existence was crumbling beneath her. Her faith in the master of mankind was flickering like a dying candle in a merciless tempest. Sevatar had offered no grand dark sorcery and woven no chaotic hexes to break her mind. He had simply wielded cold, flawless, brutal logic. His unvarnished truth had bypassed every formidable psychic ward placed upon her consciousness, infecting her thoughts with the deadliest contagion known to the human species: doubt. A solitary tear escaped the ruined crater of her empty eye socket, tracing a desperate path down her pale skin before freezing solid upon her cheek. She was trapped in a prison of her own shattering dogmas. To understand her devastation is to understand the very architecture of imperial loyalty. The servants of the Adeptus Terra are not merely taught to obey, they are fundamentally reconstructed to believe. For an astropath, this psychological conditioning is absolute and agonizingly intimate. Their minds are scoured by the soul-binding ritual, their psychic essence tethered directly to the blinding light of the Emperor himself. Their sanity relies upon the absolute certainty of his divine righteousness. When an astropath experiences profound cognitive dissonance, it is not merely a philosophical crisis, it is a catastrophic mental feedback loop. To question the Emperor is to sever the psychic tether holding their minds above the turbulent madness of the warp. Losing faith therefore manifests as literal, excruciating physical agony. The delicate neuropathways that channel astrotelepathy begin to cannibalize themselves, searing the brain with phantom fires and tearing the nervous system apart from the inside. She was enduring this silent immolation right now, her body screaming as her deep indoctrination warred against the undeniable blood-soaked logic of the Night Lord. She desperately tried to find the words to counter his devastating assessment of order and anarchy, but her throat produced nothing but a ragged gasp. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she could not refute him. The grand hypocrisy of the Imperium had been laid bare before her blind eyes, stripped of its golden veneer and revealed as just another tyranny built on a foundation of endless slaughter. Her silence in the pitch-black cell was deafening. It was the heavy, crushing quiet of a mortal soul, surrendering its most cherished delusion. She finally broke, weeping softly and sobbing quietly into the oppressive darkness as the agony of her failing faith racked her withered body. From the shadows across the cell, Sevatar listened to the broken weeping of his former interrogator. He had won this war of ideals, entirely dismantling her righteousness piece by piece. Yet the first captain took absolutely no joy in the victory. He simply sat in the gloom, letting the weight of her shattered reality settle into the frozen air, preparing to speak again. He waited for her piteous sobs to subside, for he had one last truth to impart. The hollow silence stretches between them, thick with the ash of a shattered faith. The astropath has no more arguments to offer, her desperate devotion finally ground to dust beneath the grinding wheels of cold, merciless logic. It is in this profound quiet that Sevatar, first captain of the Night Lords, returns to the very first inquiry she had stammered into the gloom. He delivers his final conclusion, not with the raving spittle of a madman, but with the quiet, devastating certainty of a scholar closing a ledger. The traitor legions, he explains, are not the ones who changed. They are simply the true loyalists who finally refused to keep lying for the Emperor. For 2 centuries, the Great Crusade was a ceaseless tide of genocide, a march of systematic annihilation ordered by a master who demanded butchery but insisted upon being called a savior. The Space Marines were forged to be monsters, unleashed upon the galaxy to break worlds and slaughter entire species in the billions. Sevatar lays bare the hypocrisy of their brother legions, the ones who remained tethered to terror. Those celebrated champions cowardly hid behind cloaks of false honor and gilded virtue. They washed the innocent blood from their ceramite and wrote epic poems about their own nobility, pretending they were anything other than bespoke instruments of mass murder. To Sevatar, the traitors merely embraced the monstrous reality of their own existence. The true psychological schism that fractured the galaxy at large was forged upon the black sands of the drop site massacre. To the blind loyalists of Terra, the slaughter at Istvan V appeared as an incomprehensible betrayal, a sudden and catastrophic descent into madness. Yet for many of the Astartes who stood with the War Master, Istvan was not a descent into madness. It was a brutal awakening. As they turned their bolters upon their brothers, they stripped away the suffocating veneer of imperial righteousness. They looked upon the slaughtered fields and accepted the grim truth of their design. They were killers, and they would no longer wear the masks of righteous knights. The master of mankind had built an empire upon a foundation of blood and shadow, yet demanded his sons stand in the light and preach of peace. To betray such a colossal, hypocritical lie was the only honest thing left for them to do. It was an act of profound, terrifying integrity. The Astropath sits paralyzed, entirely broken by the terrible weight of this revelation. The interrogation is over, for there is nothing left to ask and no comfortable delusion left to hide behind. The Prince of Crows watches her from the shadows of his cell, perfectly content in his verdict. They are left together in the dark, two souls bound by the crushing realization of what their species has become. The quietness lingers now, heavy with the dawn of a new understanding regarding the true, inescapable nature of their respective imprisonments. Chapter 19. The Freedom of the Cage. Look upon the Prince of Crows in the deep dark. He is a giant of genetically forged muscle and scarred flesh, entombed within the freezing belly of the invincible reason. Heavy suppressor chains of cold iron wrap endlessly around his scarred limbs, binding him so tightly that even the simple act of drawing breath brings agony. He is sealed inside an oubliette of absolute suffocating blackness. By every physical metric known to the galaxy, Jago Sevatarion is the most brutally restrained creature in existence. Yet within the cold confines of this unyielding cage, he has found something no loyal son of the Emperor will ever possess. He has found absolute, terrifying freedom. Consider the profound irony of the first captain of the VIII Legion. Among all the wayward sons of the Primarchs, Sevatar alone holds no illusions about his nature or the merciless reality of the cosmos. He does not seek vindication from a father who hated him, nor does he crave the hollow glory of the War Master who leads the galaxy into ruin. He is utterly unburdened by the hypocritical righteousness of the Loyalists, just as he remains untainted by the desperate, clawing madness of the traitors who worship warp-born gods. His mind is a crystalline sanctuary of brutal truth. He accepts exactly what he is, a weapon of terror forged for a universe of monsters. In that stark, unflinching acceptance, his spirit is entirely unbound. The chains that bind his flesh cannot reach the quiet clarity of his thoughts. He sits in the freezing dark, totally at peace with his own damnation. Then there is the Astropath who stands before him in the shadows. She possesses the authority to leave this dungeon. She is physically unchained, free to turn her back on the Prince of Crows and walk the towering, vaulted corridors of the Dark Angel's flagship. Yet as Sevatar speaks his soft, damning truths, the terrible reality of her own existence crushes the breath from her frail lungs. She is the true prisoner in this room. She is a chained slave to a dead philosophy, bound by her very soul to a distant emperor who lied to his children and fed his empire to the fires of an endless, senseless war. Her entire life has been a sequence of agonizing psychic bindings, forced sacrifices and silent servitude. She has been caged by duty, caged by blind doctrine, and caged by the searing light of the golden throne that burns away her humanity day by day. The towering legionary in the chains requires no pity from a mortal soul. It is the imprisoned giant who pities her. This grim paradox hangs in the stagnant air of the oubliette, as cold and undeniable as the iron wrapped around his chest. The prisoner is entirely liberated, while the jailer remains forever enslaved to a dying dream. The beautiful, cruel logic of the Night Lord dismantles the last fragile pillars of her faith, leaving nothing behind but the bitter ash of ruined devotion. She realizes with a sickening drop in her stomach that the walls of her true cell are built from blind loyalty and willful ignorance. There is no escape from the cage of the Imperium because that cage is constructed within the minds of its subjects. Unable to bear the overwhelming weight of his absolute freedom, the frail Astropath finally turns away from the dark. She gathers the ragged, trembling remnants of her broken faith and slowly steps back toward the heavy iron door. Chapter 20. The Eyes in the Dark. The Astropath turns away from the Prince of Crows. She strikes the base of her staff against the unforgiving plasteel of the cell deck. It is a desperate demand for release. Beyond the heavy adamantium vault doors, the legionary jailer engages the release mechanisms. The great slab of metal groans and grinds open. A weak and sickly pale light spills into the abyssal gloom of the prison. It is the light of the Imperium, yet it feels infinitely colder than the shadow she is leaving behind. She steps over the threshold without uttering a single word. Her mind is irreparably fractured by the sheer weight of the truth she has witnessed. She is entirely unable to look back at the monster she came to interrogate. The heavy vault door begins its agonizingly slow crawl back into place. The wedge of pale illumination upon the floor narrows, plunging the chamber back toward absolute and suffocating darkness. Yet in that final and dying sliver of artificial light, the face of Jago Sevatarion is revealed one last time. His self-aware and pitch-black Nostraman eyes reflect the fading sliver of the galaxy outside. He is smiling. It is a smile of absolute and terrifying victory. The door seals shut with the finality of a tomb. Only the heavy rattle of a single iron chain remains in the pitch blackness. Here the chroniclers of the Adeptus Terra find a vast and chilling void in the great archives. The ultimate fate of the first captain of the Night Lords remains an eternal and maddening mystery. There are no surviving records of his execution. There are no credible accounts of his escape. He simply vanishes into the shadowed margins of the Horus heresy, swallowed by the very darkness he called his closest ally. Whether he rotted in that subterranean cell, forgotten by the burning galaxy he helped to ignite, is entirely unrecorded. Whether he broke his chains and carved a bloody path back to the treacherous stars remains a mystery. We simply do not know. Perhaps it does not matter. The true horror does not lie in the physical destiny of Jago Sevatarion. The terror lies in the undeniable reality that his words survived his imprisonment perfectly intact. The broken Astropath carried his venomous and unassailable truths out into the wider Imperium, her soul permanently stained by his logic. Sevatar established his ultimate intellectual supremacy over her transient physical freedom. He stripped away her comforting lies and left her with nothing but the terrifying reality of the imperial condition. He remained the undefeated truth in the dark, a shadow of pure clarity against the hypocritical dawn of the Emperor and his broken dream. The Imperium continued to bleed and decay for 10,000 agonizing years, walking the exact path of ruin he predicted with such merciless precision. His physical form may have turned to dust millennia ago, or perhaps it prowls the darkest reaches of the cosmos to this very day. Yet his philosophy remains immortal. His judgment echoes eternally in the dark, a cold and rattling chain in the quiet places of the galaxy, waiting for those brave enough or foolish enough to listen.